"Step out of the vehicle now!" Officer Derek Sullivan's voice cut through the crisp October morning like a blade. His hand rested on his service weapon as he approached the rusted pickup truck pulled over on the shoulder of Highway 101. Behind the wheel sat a man in his early 30s, wearing a faded Army field jacket with patches that made Sullivan's jaw clench. Another stolen Valor case, he thought. Another fake soldier, trying to cash in on respect he never earned. Jake Morrison slowly raised his hands, keeping them visible on the steering wheel. He'd been through this before. The suspicious looks, the questions, the assumption that someone like him couldn't possibly have served. His jacket was authentic, earned through blood and sacrifice in the mountains of Afghanistan, but he'd learned that explaining only made things worse with certain types of cops. "I said, get out!" Sullivan barked again, his partner Officer Brad Mitchell emerging from the passenger side of the patrol car, looking uncomfortable with the escalating tension. The traffic stop had started as a routine check for a broken taillight, but the moment Sullivan spotted the Special Forces patch on Jake's jacket through the rear window, everything changed. Jake slowly opened the door and stepped onto the asphalt, his movements deliberate and calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He was 6 feet tall, lean but muscular, with the kind of stillness that came from years of training. His dark hair was shorter than civilian standard, and his green eyes held a depth that spoke of things seen and done in places most people couldn't imagine. "Turn around, hands behind your back," Sullivan ordered, already reaching for his handcuffs. Mitchell stepped forward, his voice uncertain. "Derek, maybe we should just run his license and—" "No," Sullivan cut him off sharply. "Look at this guy. Does he look like Special Forces material to you? That jacket's probably from a surplus store, and those patches are fake as hell. I'm tired of these wannabes disrespecting real soldiers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The morning had started peacefully enough for Jake Morrison. He'd risen before dawn in his small apartment above Murphy's Auto Shop on Pine Street, where he worked as a mechanic. The same routine every day for the past 8 months, since he'd moved to Riverside County, Oregon. Coffee black, no sugar, shower quick and efficient. Work clothes that had seen better days but were clean and functional. The only luxury he allowed himself was the worn Army field jacket that hung by the door, the one item from his service days he couldn't bring himself to pack away completely. Riverside County was the kind of place where pickup trucks outnumbered sedans 3-1, where the local diner served coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and where most people still believed in saying good morning to strangers. Population 3,700, nestled between rolling hills covered in Douglas fir and oak trees that turned brilliant gold and red each autumn. It was exactly the kind of quiet, anonymous place Jake had been searching for when he'd left the chaos of his previous life behind. The town had welcomed him with the casual acceptance small communities showed to useful newcomers. Murphy, the gruff owner of the auto shop, had taken one look at Jake's steady hands and intuitive understanding of engines and offered him a job on the spot. The diner owner, a weathered woman named Betty, who'd been serving truckers and locals for 30 years, had started saving him the corner booth without being asked. Even the mailman, Charlie, had learned to leave packages for other tenants with Jake when they weren't home, recognizing the reliability that seemed to radiate from the quiet young man. But Jake Morrison was carrying more than just the weight of a small-town existence. Beneath the calm exterior and the methodical routine lay memories that surfaced without warning. The sound of helicopters overhead could make him freeze mid-conversation. Sudden loud noises sent his heart racing. The smell of diesel fuel could transport him back to convoy routes where every pile of roadside debris might hide an improvised explosive device. He'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the Army's Special Forces, earning commendations he never talked about, and losing brothers whose names he whispered during sleepless nights. The transition to civilian life had been brutal, not just the obvious challenges of finding work and housing, but the deeper struggle of existing in a world where his skills felt useless, and his experiences seemed impossibly foreign to the people around him. He'd tried living in larger cities first, but the noise and crowds had been overwhelming. The Department of Veterans Affairs had helped with counseling and benefits, but the real healing had come through finding purpose in simple work and the gentle rhythm of small-town life. That morning, Jake had been driving to the Pine Street Diner for his usual breakfast of coffee and toast when Officer Derek Sullivan had spotted his broken taillight and decided to make what should have been a routine traffic stop into something much more complicated. Officer Derek Sullivan had been patrolling Highway 101 for 6 years, and in his mind, he'd seen every type of person this county had to offer: speeders and drunk drivers, domestic disturbance calls, and petty theft reports. He prided himself on being able to read people quickly, to spot the troublemakers and the liars before they could spin their stories. At 32 years old, he was ambitious, well-groomed, and absolutely certain that his 8 years in law enforcement had taught him everything he needed to know about human nature. Sullivan had grown up in Riverside County, the son of a respected local businessman who owned 3 hardware stores across the region. He'd been popular in high school, captain of the football team, and had married his sweetheart Sarah just 2 years after graduation. Their life was picture perfect by small-town standards. A neat house with a white picket fence, 2 young children who played Little League, and a position in the community that commanded respect. Sullivan saw himself as a guardian of everything good and decent about his hometown, and he had zero tolerance for people who didn't fit his vision of how things should be. The stolen Valor cases particularly infuriated him. In the past year, the department had arrested 3 different men for wearing military uniforms or claiming service records they didn't possess. One had been panhandling outside the grocery store in a Marine's dress uniform he'd bought online. Another had been caught lying about his deployment history to impress women at the local bar. The third had been using fake military credentials to get veteran discounts at local businesses. Each arrest had made Sullivan feel like he was personally defending every real veteran in the county from these despicable frauds. So when he'd pulled over Jake Morrison for the broken taillight and caught sight of that Special Forces patch through the rear window, every alarm bell in Sullivan's head had started ringing. The man looked too young, too rough around the edges, too much like the drifters and troublemakers who sometimes passed through town looking for easy marks or quick scores. Real Special Forces soldiers, in Sullivan's experience, carried themselves differently. They were polished, professional, obvious in their bearing and confidence. This guy looked like he'd been sleeping in his truck and wearing the same clothes for days. Sullivan's partner, Officer Brad Mitchell, was a different story entirely. At 26, Mitchell was newer to the force and less certain about his ability to read situations correctly. He'd grown up in a military family, his father a career Navy man who'd instilled in him a deep respect for service members of all branches. Mitchell had considered enlisting himself before deciding on law enforcement, and he'd learned to recognize the subtle signs that often marked veterans adjusting to civilian life. The way they scanned rooms automatically when entering, the precise, economical movements, the tendency to position themselves with their backs to walls and clear views of exits. Watching Jake Morrison step out of his truck, Mitchell saw all of those signs and more. The man's posture was alert, but not aggressive, his hands clearly visible, his movements suggesting someone who understood exactly how to de-escalate a potentially dangerous situation. These weren't the behaviors of someone pretending to be a soldier. These were the ingrained habits of someone who'd been trained to survive in genuinely hostile environments. But Sullivan wasn't interested in Mitchell's observations. His mind was already made up, his handcuffs already in his hand as he ordered Jake to turn around. The morning air was crisp with the promise of winter, and a light mist was rising from the asphalt as early commuters began their drive to work in the larger towns 30 miles south. What should have been a 5-minute traffic stop was about to become something that would change multiple lives forever. Jake felt the familiar weight of injustice settling on his shoulders as Sullivan roughly grabbed his wrists and snapped the cuffs into place. He'd been through variations of this scenario before, though never quite this aggressively. Store security guards who assumed he was shoplifting, employers who questioned his references, even well-meaning civilians who thanked him for his service while clearly doubting he'd actually served. He'd learned that fighting back, even verbally, only made things worse. Better to stay calm, comply with orders, and hope that cooler heads would eventually prevail. "What's your name, soldier boy?" Sullivan asked sarcastically, spinning Jake around to face him. The contempt in his voice was unmistakable, and Mitchell winced at his partner's tone. "Jake Morrison," Jake replied quietly, meeting Sullivan's eyes without challenge or submission. "I was just heading to breakfast." "Sure you were," Sullivan sneered. "And I suppose you're going to tell me you earned all those patches the hard way? 3 tours in Afghanistan, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, the whole 9 yards. Jake's jaw tightened slightly. Sullivan's guesses were surprisingly accurate, but explaining would only sound like the kind of elaborate lie the officer was clearly expecting. "I'd prefer to call my lawyer," Jake said instead. "Oh, you'd prefer that, would you?" Sullivan's voice rose. "Well, I'd prefer that people like you stop stealing the honor that belongs to real American heroes. You're under arrest for stolen valor, identity fraud, and whatever else I can think of by the time we get back to the station." Mitchell stepped forward again, his discomfort obvious. "Derek, we don't actually have evidence of any fraud. Maybe we should just write the citation for the taillight and—" "Are you questioning my judgment, Mitchell?" Sullivan's eyes were dangerous now, his authority challenged in front of a suspect. "Because if you can't support your partner, maybe you need to reconsider whether you're cut out for this job." The threat hung in the air between them. Mitchell was still probationary, still learning, still dependent on Sullivan's evaluations for his future with the department. He looked at Jake, seeing something in the man's eyes that spoke of genuine pain and resignation, then back at his partner's rigid certainty. The choice felt impossible, but his career hung in the balance. "No, sir," Mitchell said quietly, hating himself for the words. "I support you." Sullivan smiled with satisfaction and grabbed Jake's arm to lead him toward the patrol car. "Smart man. Now let's get this faker processed and see how long it takes him to confess." As Jake was pushed into the back seat of the patrol car, he caught sight of his reflection in the window. The face looking back at him was tired, weathered beyond its years, marked by experiences that couldn't be faked or stolen. He thought about his brothers who hadn't made it home, about the promises he'd made to their families, about the honor he'd tried so hard to carry with dignity, despite the world's determination to strip it away piece by piece. The patrol car pulled away from the shoulder, leaving Jake's truck behind, with its broken taillight blinking weakly in the morning sun. In the distance, the mountains of Riverside County rose against a sky that promised rain, and somewhere in town, people were beginning their normal days with no idea that a storm was about to break over their quiet community. Captain Maria Rodriguez had been running the Riverside County Police Department for 8 years, and she prided herself on knowing every officer under her command. Some were natural peacekeepers, drawn to law enforcement by a genuine desire to serve their community. Others were adrenaline junkies who craved the excitement and authority. A few, like Derek Sullivan, were motivated by a rigid sense of order and an unshakable belief in their own moral authority. Rodriguez had been watching Sullivan's career with a mixture of appreciation and concern. He was efficient, thorough, and absolutely committed to upholding what he saw as the law. His arrest record was impressive, his paperwork was always perfect, and his courtroom testimony was clear and convincing. But there was an inflexibility about him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story that sometimes worried her, a tendency to see complex human situations in stark black and white terms that didn't always serve justice well. The call came in at 8:30 that morning, just as Rodriguez was settling in with her second cup of coffee and the incident reports from the night shift. Sullivan's voice was crisp and professional as he reported the arrest of a suspect for stolen valor and fraud. "Copy that, Sullivan," Rodriguez replied, making notes on her pad. "What's the evidence?" Subject was wearing military uniform items with Special Forces insignia, appeared to be impersonating a service member. When questioned, his story didn't add up. "Classic stolen valor case, Captain." Rodriguez frowned slightly. The department had indeed handled several stolen Valor cases recently, and they'd all been relatively straightforward. Men caught in obvious lies, wearing uniforms that didn't fit properly, unable to answer basic questions about military procedures or locations. But something in Sullivan's tone suggested this case might be different. "Bring him in," she ordered. "I'll want to interview him myself before we process the charges." As Rodriguez hung up the phone, she couldn't shake the feeling that this morning was about to become much more complicated than she'd planned. Outside her office window, Riverside County was waking up to another, ordinary day. But she'd learned over the years that ordinary days had a way of becoming extraordinary without warning, and not always in good ways. The Riverside County Police Department occupied a modest brick building on Main Street, wedged between the county courthouse and a family-owned pharmacy that had been serving the community for 3 generations. The building's design reflected the pragmatic sensibilities of its 1970s construction, all clean lines and functional spaces with fluorescent lighting that cast everything in a harsh, institutional glow. The lobby featured wood-paneled walls decorated with commendation photos and a large American flag that had flown over the county building since the department's founding. Captain Maria Rodriguez had designed her office to reflect both authority and approachability. Her desk, positioned diagonally in the corner, offered clear views of both the parking lot and the hallway leading to the holding cells. Behind her chair hung her law enforcement certifications, alongside a photograph of her graduating class from the police academy 15 years earlier. On the opposite wall, a large map of Riverside County was marked with colored pins, indicating crime patterns and patrol zones. The morning light streaming through the single window illuminated dust motes dancing in the air and cast long shadows across the paperwork that never seemed to diminish, no matter how many hours she worked. Rodriguez had grown up 30 miles north in a family where service was considered both duty and privilege. Her father had been a firefighter for 26 years. Her brother served as a paramedic, and her younger sister taught elementary school in the same district where they'd all been educated. Maria had chosen law enforcement because she believed deeply in the concept of justice, not as an abstract ideal, but as a practical necessity for communities to function and thrive. Her approach to policing emphasized de-escalation, community engagement, and the understanding that every arrest represented someone's son or daughter, someone's story that had taken a wrong turn. The captain's reputation extended beyond Riverside County. She'd been invited to speak at regional conferences about community policing strategies, had consulted with neighboring departments on officer training programs, and had earned the respect of both her superiors and the officers under her command. Her leadership style combined clear expectations with genuine care for her people, recognizing that good policing required not just technical skills but emotional intelligence and the wisdom to recognize when situations were more complex than they initially appeared. When Officer Sullivan's patrol car pulled into the department parking lot at 8:45 that morning, Rodriguez was already watching from her window. She observed Sullivan's body language as he emerged from the driver's seat, noting the rigid set of his shoulders and the brisk efficiency of his movements. Something about his demeanor suggested he was anticipating validation rather than simply processing a routine arrest. Mitchell, by contrast, remained seated in the passenger seat for several long moments before slowly getting out, his reluctance obvious even from the second-floor window. The man Sullivan escorted from the back seat moved with a controlled grace that immediately caught Rodriguez's attention. Even handcuffed, even clearly under arrest, Jake Morrison carried himself with a quiet dignity that spoke of inner strength rather than defiance. His posture was alert but not aggressive, his eyes scanning the environment with the kind of automatic assessment she'd observed in other veterans. As Sullivan guided him toward the building entrance, Rodriguez noted that the suspect never pulled against the restraints or exhibited the agitation typical of people experiencing their first arrest. Rodriguez made her way downstairs to the booking area, arriving just as Sullivan began the standard processing procedures. The booking room was sterile and efficient, designed to handle the mundane realities of small-town law enforcement. A single metal table dominated the center of the space, surrounded by filing cabinets and a computer terminal that connected to state and federal databases. The walls were painted an institutional green that someone had once believed would be calming, but instead created an atmosphere of bureaucratic detachment. "Sullivan," Rodriguez called as she entered the room. "Before you start the paperwork, I'd like to speak with the suspect." Sullivan looked up from the forms he'd been preparing, his expression confident. "Of course, Captain. This one's pretty straightforward. Classic stolen Valor case, just like the others we've handled recently. Guy was wearing a Special Forces jacket with deployment patches, but when I questioned him, his story fell apart immediately." Rodriguez studied Jake Morrison more carefully. He stood quietly beside the booking table, his hands now uncuffed but held loosely at his sides. His field jacket, which Sullivan had confiscated as evidence, lay folded on a nearby chair. The patches were visible from where she stood, and they appeared authentic to her untrained eye. More significantly, the man wearing them had the kind of physical bearing and alertness she'd learned to associate with genuine military experience. "What specifically about his story didn't add up?" Rodriguez asked. Sullivan consulted his notes. "Well, for starters, he claimed to have served in Afghanistan, but he couldn't provide specific details about his deployment when I questioned him. And look at him, Captain. Does he really look like Special Forces material to you? These guys are usually more polished, more professional in their appearance." Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "Officer Sullivan, I'm not sure physical appearance is necessarily the best indicator of military service. Some of our most distinguished veterans have struggled with the transition to civilian life." Mitchell, who had been standing quietly near the door, cleared his throat. "Captain, if I may, the suspect was extremely cooperative during the arrest. He knew exactly how to position himself, kept his hands visible at all times, followed instructions precisely. His behavior was consistent with someone who's had extensive training in dealing with law enforcement situations." Sullivan shot his partner a sharp look. "That could just mean he's been arrested before, Mitchell. Career criminals know how to act compliant when they need to." Rodriguez made a mental note of the tension between her officers but kept her focus on the larger situation. "Mr. Morrison, is it? I'm Captain Rodriguez. I'd like to ask you a few questions if you don't mind." Jake met her eyes directly. "I understand you're doing your job, Captain. I'm willing to answer whatever questions you have." His voice was calm, respectful without being submissive, and carried a slight roughness that suggested either recent stress or long-term strain. Rodriguez had interviewed hundreds of suspects over her career, and she'd developed an intuition about when people were being truthful. Something about Jake Morrison's demeanor suggested honesty rather than deception. "Officer Sullivan believes you may be impersonating a service member," Rodriguez said. "Can you tell me about your military background?" Jake was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "I served 8 years in the Army, Captain. 3 deployments to Afghanistan with the 5th Special Forces Group. I was discharged in 2018 and have been working as a mechanic here in Riverside County for the past 8 months." Sullivan snorted. "See? Vague details, no specifics. If he really served with Special Forces, he should be able to provide unit information, deployment dates, commanding officers. These stolen Valor guys always give these general answers that can't be verified." Rodriguez held up a hand to silence Sullivan, her attention focused entirely on Jake. "What was your military occupational specialty, Mr. Morrison?" 18 Bravo, Jake replied immediately. "Special Forces Weapons Sergeant. I was also trained in combat engineering and served as the team's communications specialist during my 2nd deployment." The immediate technical response gave Rodriguez pause. The military occupational specialty number was specific, and not something a civilian would likely know off the top of their head. She decided to probe deeper. "Can you tell me about your training pipeline?" Jake's answer was detailed and precise. "Basic training at Fort Benning. Advanced individual training for weapons at Fort Gordon. Airborne school back at Benning. Then the Special Forces qualification course at Fort Bragg. The Q course took 14 months. After that, language training at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, then assignment to 3rd Battalion, 5th Group at Fort Campbell. Sullivan looked less certain now, but wasn't ready to back down. Anyone can memorize that information, Captain. The internet has all sorts of military details that fakes use to make their stories sound convincing. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. That's true, Officer Sullivan. But Mr. Morrison, can you tell me something that wouldn't be readily available online? Something about the day-to-day reality of your service. Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Rodriguez could see him wrestling with memories that were clearly painful. When he spoke, his voice was softer, more distant. The worst part wasn't the combat, he said finally. It was the waiting. Hours and hours of sitting in observation posts, watching empty roads through night vision scopes, knowing that any vehicle that appeared might be carrying people who wanted to kill you. The boredom was almost worse than the fear because your mind had time to imagine everything that could go wrong. He paused, seeming to return from wherever the memory had taken him. And the smell. People don't talk about that much, but you never forget it. Diesel fuel, gun oil, burning garbage, dust that got into everything, no matter how carefully you sealed your gear. It stayed in your clothes, your hair, your skin. Sometimes I still wake up thinking I can smell it. The booking room fell silent. Even Sullivan seemed affected by the quiet intensity of Jake's words. These weren't the kind of details someone would find in online forums or military documentaries. They spoke of lived experience, of memories carved deep by years of stress and hypervigilance. Rodriguez made her decision. Officer Sullivan, I want you to run a complete background check on Mr. Morrison. Use the military database. Contact the Department of Defense if necessary. Until we have definitive information, Mr. Morrison will remain in custody, but I want this investigation done thoroughly and properly. Sullivan's jaw tightened. Captain, with respect, I believe we have sufficient evidence to proceed with charges. This man is clearly attempting to deceive us with rehearsed stories and, Officer Sullivan, Rodriguez's voice carried unmistakable authority. I've given you an order. Please carry it out immediately. The tension in the room was palpable as Sullivan reluctantly moved toward the computer terminal. Rodriguez could see the frustration in his posture, the rigid set of his shoulders that indicated he felt his professional judgment was being questioned. But she'd learned over the years that good leadership sometimes required making unpopular decisions, especially when the stakes involved someone's freedom and reputation. While Sullivan began his database search, Rodriguez turned her attention back to Jake. Mr. Morrison, is there anyone who can verify your service record? Someone we could contact who served with you? Jake considered the question carefully. There's a guy named Tommy Chen, who lives about an hour south of here in Millfield. We served together during my last deployment. He got out 6 months before I did and has been working construction since then. I haven't spoken to him in a while, but he could verify my service. Rodriguez made a note of the name and location. Anyone else? A commanding officer? Someone from your unit? Jake's expression darkened slightly. My team leader was killed in an IED attack during our 3rd deployment. My company commander retired 2 years ago and moved back to Texas. But I don't have current contact information for him. Most of the guys I served with have scattered since getting out. We don't really stay in touch much. The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Rodriguez recognized the common pattern of veterans who'd lost touch with their military families after discharge. The transition to civilian life often meant leaving behind the intense bonds forged in combat, partly by necessity, and partly because those relationships were reminders of experiences most veterans preferred to keep buried. Mitchell, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. Captain, should I contact the VA office? They might have records that could help verify his service. Good thinking, Mitchell, Rodriguez replied. Call them and see what information they can provide. Also, try to locate this Tommy Chen in Millfield. Sullivan looked up from his computer screen, his expression showing the first signs of uncertainty. Captain, I'm having some difficulty accessing the military personnel database. The system is asking for higher-level clearance than my login provides. Rodriguez frowned. What level of clearance does it require? It's asking for federal law enforcement credentials or specific military authorization. Apparently, some service records are restricted for security reasons. This was an unexpected complication. Rodriguez knew that certain military records, particularly those involving special forces or classified operations, might have restricted access, but she'd never encountered this situation before in her career. Try contacting the Department of Defense directly, she instructed. Explain that we have a law enforcement matter that requires verification of service records. They should be able to provide some level of confirmation. As Sullivan made the phone call, Rodriguez found herself studying Jake Morrison more intently. Everything about his behavior, his knowledge, and his responses suggested genuine military experience, but the restricted database access was puzzling and potentially significant. Why would a simple service verification require federal clearance unless there was something unusual about his military record? The morning was stretching toward noon, and what had started as a routine traffic stop was evolving into something much more complex. Outside the booking room windows, Riverside County was going about its normal business, unaware that inside their police station, a mystery was unfolding that would challenge assumptions and force difficult questions about justice, truth, and the price of service. The phone call to the Department of Defense proved frustrating and inconclusive. Sullivan was transferred through multiple departments, each claiming they couldn't access the specific records needed or that additional authorization would be required. The bureaucratic runaround was typical of government agencies, but it was also preventing them from resolving what should have been a straightforward verification process. Meanwhile, Officer Mitchell had more success with his calls. The VA office confirmed that they had records for a Jake Morrison, who had been receiving benefits since 2018, but privacy regulations prevented them from sharing specific details without proper legal authorization. However, the fact that the VA was providing benefits strongly suggested legitimate military service. The search for Tommy Chen proved easier. Mitchell located a construction company in Millfield that employed someone by that name and was able to reach him by phone within an hour. "Captain," Mitchell reported after ending the call, "I spoke with Tommy Chen. He confirmed that he served with Jake Morrison in Afghanistan. He says they were on the same team for 18 months and that Morrison saved his life during an ambush in 2017. He seemed genuinely surprised to hear that Morrison was being questioned about his service record." Sullivan, who had been growing increasingly frustrated with his inability to access definitive military records, looked skeptical. That doesn't prove anything conclusively. These guys could be working together, covering for each other's fake stories. Rodriguez was beginning to lose patience with Sullivan's rigid insistence on guilt, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. "Officer Sullivan, at what point would you be willing to consider that Mr. Morrison might be telling the truth?" "When I see official documentation that proves his service," Sullivan replied stubbornly. "Until then, I maintain that we have a stolen Valor case here." The standoff was interrupted by a knock on the booking room door. A young officer named Davis poked his head in. "Captain, there's someone here asking about Jake Morrison. Says he's a friend and heard about the arrest." Rodriguez glanced at Jake, who looked surprised. "I don't know who that could be," he said quietly. "Send them in," Rodriguez decided. "Let's see what they have to say." The man who entered the booking room was in his 50s, wearing work clothes and carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to physical labor and outdoor work. His face was weathered and kind, with intelligent eyes that quickly assessed the situation. He nodded respectfully to Rodriguez before looking at Jake with obvious concern. "Jake, what the hell happened? Betty at the diner said you got arrested this morning." Jake looked genuinely surprised to see the man. "Murphy? How did you find out about this?" The newcomer, Apparently Murphy, from the auto shop, turned to Rodriguez. "Captain, I'm Pete Murphy. I own Murphy's auto shop where Jake works. I heard he was arrested for stolen Valor, and I came down here to tell you, that's the biggest load of horseshit I've heard in 30 years. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow at the language, but was interested in what Murphy had to say. "What makes you so certain, Mr. Murphy?" Murphy gestured toward Jake. "This boy's been working for me for 8 months, and I've watched him every day. The way he moves, the way he thinks, the way he handles stress. I served 2 tours in Vietnam, Captain, and I know what combat does to a man. Jake's got it written all over him, whether he wants to admit it or not." Sullivan stepped forward. "Mr. Murphy, with respect, you can't diagnose military service just by observing someone's behavior. We need actual documentation, not character references." Murphy fixed Sullivan with a steady stare. "Son, I've been around enough soldiers to know the real thing when I see it. This man has nightmares that wake up half the neighborhood. He startles at loud noises. He positions himself in restaurants so he can see all the exits. He works like a man who's grateful for every peaceful day he gets. You want to tell me that's something he learned from watching movies?" The passion in Murphy's voice was unmistakable, and Rodriguez could see that his words were having an impact even on Sullivan. Here was another veteran, someone with his own service record, vouching for Jake's authenticity based on observations that went beyond surface appearances. "There's something else," Murphy continued. "About 3 months ago, we had a customer bring in a truck that had been making a weird noise. None of us could figure out what was wrong with it. Jake took one listen and said it sounded like an IED going off. Turned out there was a loose heat shield that was vibrating against the exhaust pipe. That's not a connection a civilian would make, Captain. That's something that comes from hearing too many explosions." The booking room fell silent again, as everyone absorbed Murphy's words. The detail was specific, technical, and exactly the kind of associative memory that would develop from traumatic combat experience. It wasn't something that could be faked or learned from research. Rodriguez made her decision. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to release you pending further investigation. Officer Sullivan will continue working to verify your service records through proper channels, but I don't believe we have sufficient evidence to hold you at this time." Sullivan's face flushed with anger. "Captain, I strongly disagree with this decision. We're setting a dangerous precedent by releasing someone without proper verification of their claims." "Officer Sullivan," Rodriguez's voice was firm and final. "My decision stands. Process Mr. Morrison's release immediately." As the paperwork was completed and Jake's personal effects were returned, Rodriguez found herself reflecting on the morning's events. The investigation had raised more questions than answers, but her instincts told her that Jake Morrison was telling the truth about his service. The restricted database access, the VA benefits, the testimony from Tommy Chin and Pete Murphy, and most importantly, Jake's own detailed knowledge and demeanor all pointed toward genuine military experience. But the incident had also revealed troubling aspects of Officer Sullivan's approach to law enforcement. His unwillingness to consider evidence that contradicted his initial assumptions, his rigid adherence to preconceived notions, and his resistance to his commanding officer's judgment were all concerning indicators that would need to be addressed. As Jake prepared to leave the police station, Rodriguez approached him privately. "Mr. Morrison, I want to apologize for the way this situation was handled. I believe Officer Sullivan acted with good intentions, but his methods were inappropriate." Jake nodded quietly. "I understand, Captain. It's not the first time this has happened, and it probably won't be the last. I appreciate you taking the time to investigate properly." "One more thing," Rodriguez said. "If you're comfortable sharing, why are your military records restricted in the database? That's unusual for standard service members." Jake was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "Some of the operations my team was involved in are still classified, Captain. The records are sealed for security reasons. It's not uncommon for Special Forces personnel who worked on sensitive missions." Rodriguez nodded, understanding now why the database verification had been so difficult. Jake Morrison wasn't just a veteran. He was a veteran whose service had involved classified operations that the government preferred to keep hidden from public view. As Jake left the police station and walked toward his truck, which had been towed to the station parking lot, Rodriguez watched from her office window. Pete Murphy waited by the vehicle, clearly intending to give Jake a ride back to the auto shop. The two men spoke briefly before getting into Murphy's truck and driving away. The morning's events had concluded, but Rodriguez knew the implications would linger. Officer Sullivan's behavior would require formal review and additional training. The department's procedures for handling stolen Valor cases would need refinement to prevent similar incidents. And somewhere in the federal bureaucracy, Jake Morrison's service record remained locked away, protected by classifications that acknowledged the reality of his sacrifice while making it nearly impossible to verify. Outside, Riverside County continued its peaceful existence, most residents unaware that their quiet community had just witnessed a collision between assumption and truth, between the desire for simple answers and the complex realities of service and sacrifice. The morning sun climbed higher into a clear autumn sky, and life went on, carrying with it the echo of questions about justice, truth, and the price of protecting those who had protected others. The aftermath of Jake Morrison's arrest rippled through Riverside County like stones thrown into a still pond. News traveled fast in a small town, especially news involving law enforcement and questions of honor. By afternoon, the story had reached every coffee shop, barber shop, and gathering place where locals discussed the events that shaped their community. At the Pine Street Diner, Betty wiped down tables with more force than necessary, her displeasure evident to anyone who cared to notice. She'd been serving Jake Morrison breakfast 3 times a week for 8 months, and she'd developed the kind of protective fondness that experienced waitresses reserved for their most reliable customers. The idea that someone had questioned his military service felt like a personal insult to everything she believed about reading people and recognizing character. "That Sullivan boy always was too sure of himself," she muttered to Lisa Park, the younger waitress who worked the morning shift. "Even in high school, he thought he knew everything about everybody." "Some people never learn that assumptions make asses out of all of us." Lisa nodded, refilling the coffee pot for the 3rd time that hour. The lunch crowd had been unusually talkative, with everyone wanting to discuss the morning's events and share their opinions about what had happened. The general consensus seemed to be that Officer Sullivan had overstepped his authority, but there were a few voices defending his actions as necessary vigilance against fraud. At Murphy's auto shop, Pete Murphy found himself fielding phone calls from customers and neighbors who'd heard about Jake's arrest. Most were supportive, expressing outrage that anyone would question the service of a man they'd come to respect for his quiet competence and reliability. But a few callers were more cautious, wondering if there might be some truth to the accusations. "People are talking, Jake," Murphy said as they worked together on a transmission repair that afternoon. "Most folks are on your side, but you know how it is in small towns. Once doubt gets planted, it has a way of growing." Jake nodded without looking up from his work. He'd been through similar situations before, and he understood the social dynamics involved. Small communities valued trust and authenticity above almost everything else, but they also had long memories for scandal and controversy. Even being cleared of wrongdoing didn't always erase the stain of having been accused. "I appreciate you coming down to the station," Jake said quietly. "You didn't have to do that," Murphy snorted. "Course I did. Nobody was going to stand by and watch you get railroaded by some overeager cop who doesn't know his ass from his elbow. Besides, I meant what I said in there. I've been around enough soldiers to recognize the real deal." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Tommy Chen, who had driven up from Millfield after receiving Mitchell's phone call. Tommy was shorter than Jake, but built like a fire plug, with the kind of compact strength that came from years of physical labor. His face lit up when he saw Jake working under the hood of a pickup truck. "Well, I'll be damned," Tommy called out, "if it isn't the famous Jake Morrison, causing trouble with the local law enforcement." Jake straightened up, a genuine smile crossing his face for the first time that day. "Tommy, What the hell are you doing here? Got a call from some cop asking about your military service, Tommy replied, extending his hand for a firm shake. Figured I better drive up and make sure you weren't trying to pass yourself off as a war hero or something. The two men embraced briefly, the kind of restrained affection common among veterans who'd shared experiences that civilian relationships couldn't replicate. Murphy watched the reunion with interest, noting the immediate change in Jake's demeanor. The tension that had been evident all day seemed to ease, replaced by the comfortable familiarity of men who'd trusted each other with their lives. "So tell me what happened," Tommy said. The cop on the phone was pretty vague about the details. Jake related the morning's events while they worked, with Tommy listening and occasionally shaking his head in disbelief. When Jake finished, Tommy was quiet for a moment before speaking. "You know, I've been dealing with some of the same crap since I got out," he said finally. "People look at us and think we're too young, too screwed up, too something to have really served, like there's supposed to be some kind of official stamp on our foreheads that proves we were there." Murphy nodded knowingly. "Same thing happened after Vietnam, except then people questioned whether we deserved respect even if they believed we'd served. Different problem, same ignorance." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Rodriguez, who pulled into the auto shop parking lot in an unmarked police car. Jake tensed automatically, old instincts preparing for confrontation, but Rodriguez's body language suggested she was there for conversation rather than enforcement. "Mr. Morrison," she said as she approached the group, "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I wanted to follow up on this morning's incident and see how you were doing." Jake wiped his hands on a shop rag before responding. "I'm fine, Captain. Just trying to get back to normal." Rodriguez looked around the auto shop, taking in the organized chaos of tools, parts, and vehicles in various stages of repair. The environment spoke of honest work and practical skills, the kind of place where competence mattered more than credentials. "I also wanted to apologize again for Officer Sullivan's handling of the situation," she continued. "His intentions may have been good, but his methods were inappropriate, and his conclusions were premature." Tommy stepped forward, extending his hand to Rodriguez. "Captain, I'm Tommy Chen. I spoke with one of your officers on the phone earlier. I served with Jake in Afghanistan." Rodriguez shook his hand, studying his face with the same careful attention she'd given Jake earlier. "I appreciate you taking the time to verify Mr. Morrison's service. Your testimony was helpful in resolving the situation." "No problem," Tommy replied. "Though I have to say, it's pretty messed up that Jake had to go through this at all. The man saved my life, Captain. He pulled me out of a burning Humvee after we hit an IED, and he did it while taking fire from 3 different directions. If that doesn't earn him the right to wear his uniform without being questioned, I don't know what does." The detail was specific and powerful, adding another layer of verification to Jake's story. Rodriguez made a mental note to include Tommy's testimony in her report on the incident. "Mr. Chen," she said, "would you be willing to provide a written statement about your service with Mr. Morrison? It would help ensure that this kind of misunderstanding doesn't happen again." Tommy nodded immediately. "Absolutely. Whatever Jake needs." Murphy, who had been listening to the conversation while pretending to organize tools, spoke up. "Captain, can I ask what's going to happen to Officer Sullivan? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like he made some pretty serious mistakes today." Rodriguez chose her words carefully. "Officer Sullivan's actions will be reviewed according to department policy. I can't discuss specific disciplinary measures, but I can assure you that appropriate steps will be taken to address any procedural violations." The diplomatic response didn't satisfy Murphy entirely, but he recognized the constraints Rodriguez faced in discussing personnel matters. The important thing was that Jake had been vindicated and that steps were being taken to prevent similar incidents. As Rodriguez prepared to leave, she turned to Jake once more. "Mr. Morrison, I want you to know that you have my personal apology and the support of this department." If you ever experience similar problems in the future, please don't hesitate to contact me directly." Jake nodded his appreciation, though his expression remained guarded. Trust, once broken, took time to rebuild, even when the break had been unintentional. After Rodriguez left, the three men returned to their work, but the conversation continued as they labored. Tommy shared stories about his own struggles with civilian employment, the difficulty of translating military skills into civilian terms, and the challenge of finding purpose in work that felt trivial compared to their combat experiences. "The hardest part," Tommy said as he helped Jake reinstall a rebuilt transmission, "is that most people have no idea what we went through over there. They see the movies, they read the news stories, but they don't understand what it's like to live with the constant awareness that everything can go to hell in an instant." Murphy, who was old enough to remember his own difficult transition from Vietnam, listened with the understanding that came from shared experience across different generations of veterans. "The country's gotten better at saying thank you," he observed, "but it hasn't gotten much better at actually taking care of people once they come home." The afternoon wore on, and gradually the tension of the morning's events began to fade. The simple rhythm of mechanical work, the camaraderie of men who understood each other's struggles, and the knowledge that truth had ultimately prevailed, combined to restore a sense of normalcy to what had been a deeply disturbing day. As closing time approached, Tommy prepared to drive back to Millfield, but not before making plans to stay in closer contact with Jake. The incident had reminded both men of the importance of maintaining connections with the people who shared their experiences and understood their struggles. "You should come down to Millfield sometime," Tommy said as he prepared to leave. "I've got a spare room, and there are a few other guys from the unit living in the area. We get together once a month. Nothing formal, just to check in and make sure everyone's doing okay." Jake considered the invitation seriously. He'd been so focused on building a new life that he'd neglected the relationships that could help sustain him through the difficult moments. The morning's events had shown him how isolated he'd become and how vulnerable that isolation made him. "I might take you up on that," he said finally. "It would be good to reconnect with some of the guys." As Tommy drove away and Murphy locked up the shop for the evening, Jake found himself reflecting on the day's events with a mixture of anger, gratitude, and resignation. The arrest had been humiliating and unjust, but it had also revealed the support system that existed around him in Riverside County. People like Murphy, Betty, and even Captain Rodriguez had been willing to stand up for him based on their own observations and convictions. Walking back to his apartment above the shop, Jake could see the lights coming on in houses throughout the town. Behind those windows, families were settling in for evening routines, secure in the knowledge that their community was safe and their neighbors were trustworthy. It was the kind of peace he'd fought to protect in places where such simple security was impossible to achieve. The incident with Officer Sullivan had been a reminder that his service, no matter how honorable or heroic, would always be subject to question by people who couldn't understand what they hadn't experienced. But it had also shown him that truth, when supported by evidence and defended by people of integrity, had the power to overcome ignorance and prejudice. As he climbed the stairs to his apartment, Jake made a mental decision to be more open about his past, to accept the support that was offered, and to trust that his community was capable of recognizing and respecting the sacrifices he'd made. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but he no longer had to walk it entirely alone. Officer Derek Sullivan sat in his patrol car outside the Riverside County Police Department at 6:30 the following morning, staring at the building where his career might be coming to an end. The conversation with Captain Rodriguez the previous evening had been brief but pointed. His handling of the Morrison case was under formal review, and he'd been placed on administrative duty pending the outcome of an internal investigation. The words had hit him like physical blows, each syllable carrying the weight of professional humiliation and personal doubt. Sullivan had barely slept the night before, replaying the events over and over in his mind, searching for some way to justify his actions or prove that his instincts had been correct. He'd been so certain that Morrison was a fraud, so convinced that his years of experience had taught him to recognize deception and stolen honor. The possibility that he'd been wrong about something so fundamental challenged everything he believed about his abilities as a law enforcement officer. The morning air carried the crisp promise of winter, and frost covered the windshields of cars in the parking lot. Sullivan watched as other officers arrived for their shifts, some nodding in his direction, others pointedly avoiding eye contact. Word of his suspension had spread through the department with the speed that bad news always traveled in close-knit organizations. He knew his colleagues were talking about him, questioning his judgment, wondering if this incident was an isolated mistake or a sign of deeper problems with his approach to policing. Inside the station, Captain Rodriguez was already at her desk, reviewing the preliminary reports from the Morrison investigation. The overnight shift had been quiet, giving her time to thoroughly examine every aspect of the previous day's events. The more she studied Sullivan's actions, the more concerned she became about patterns of behavior that suggested fundamental misunderstandings about the role of law enforcement in their community. Rodriguez had started her own career with idealistic notions about justice and truth, but 20 years of experience had taught her that effective policing required humility, empathy, and the wisdom to recognize the limits of first impressions. Good officers learn to question their assumptions, to gather evidence before reaching conclusions, and to treat every citizen with dignity regardless of their appearance or circumstances. Sullivan's rigid certainty and unwillingness to consider alternative explanations suggested he'd never fully grasped these essential principles. The captain's phone rang at 7:15, interrupting her review of the case files. The caller identified himself as Colonel James Mitchell from the Department of Defense, returning Sullivan's request for information about Jake Morrison's military service. Rodriguez took careful notes as the colonel explained the restrictions surrounding Morrison's records and provided limited verification of his service history. "Captain Rodriguez," Colonel Mitchell said, his voice carrying the authority of long military experience, "I can confirm that Jake Morrison served with distinction in the Army's Special Forces for 8 years. His record includes 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan and multiple commendations for valor under fire. However, specific details of his service remain classified due to the sensitive nature of some operations he participated in." Rodriguez felt a mixture of vindication and concern as she absorbed this information. The confirmation of Morrison's service validated her decision to release him, but it also highlighted the serious error in judgment that had led to his arrest in the first place. "Colonel, can you tell me why his records are restricted in the standard military database?" she asked. "Without going into classified details, Captain, I can tell you that Sergeant Morrison's unit was involved in operations that remain sensitive for national security reasons. Personnel records for such operations are often sealed to protect both the individuals involved and ongoing security interests." After ending the call, Rodriguez sat quietly in her office, processing the implications of what she'd learned. Jake Morrison wasn't just a veteran who'd been wrongfully accused. He was a decorated soldier whose service had been significant enough to warrant ongoing government protection. The arrest had been not just a mistake, but a serious violation of trust between law enforcement and a citizen who'd sacrificed for his country. Meanwhile, across town at Murphy's auto shop, Jake Morrison was trying to focus on his work despite the lingering effects of the previous day's humiliation. He'd arrived early, hoping that the familiar rhythm of mechanical repair would help quiet the anger and frustration that had kept him awake most of the night. The simple act of diagnosing engine problems and crafting solutions with his hands usually provided a kind of meditation, a way to channel the restless energy that had plagued him since leaving the military. Pete Murphy found him under the hood of a Ford pickup at 7:30, already deep into a complex transmission repair that would normally take most mechanics half a day to complete. Murphy had been working on cars for 35 years, and he'd learned to read the emotional state of his employees through their work habits. Jake's movements were more aggressive than usual, his tool selection more decisive, his entire approach suggesting someone working through anger and frustration. "You're going to strip those bolts if you keep tightening them like that," Murphy observed mildly, setting a cup of coffee on the workbench nearby. Jake paused and took a deep breath, recognizing the truth in Murphy's words. "Sorry, Pete. I'm still pretty wound up about yesterday." Murphy nodded understandingly. "Can't say I blame you. Having your honor questioned like that would set any man's teeth on edge. But don't let one ignorant cop's mistake eat you alive from the inside." The older mechanic's words carried the weight of personal experience. Murphy had faced his own challenges returning from Vietnam, dealing with a society that had been hostile to veterans and skeptical of their service. He'd learned that carrying anger was like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die from it. "The thing is," Jake said, setting down his wrench and facing Murphy directly, "this isn't the first time something like this has happened. Ever since I got out, there have been people who look at me and assume I'm lying about my service. Store clerks who question my veterans discount, employers who doubt my references, even other veterans who think I'm too young or too messed up to have really been special forces." Murphy studied Jake's face, seeing the accumulated pain of years of having his integrity questioned. "What do you think drives that kind of suspicion? Why are people so quick to assume the worst?" Jake considered the question while cleaning his hands with a shop rag. "I think part of it is that people have certain expectations about what soldiers should look like, how they should act, what their stories should sound like. When reality doesn't match those expectations, it's easier to assume someone's lying than to question whether the expectations were wrong in the first place." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Sarah Williams, a counselor from the local Veterans Affairs office who had driven up from the county seat after hearing about Jake's arrest. She was a woman in her 40s with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too much suffering but hadn't lost their capacity for compassion. Her work with veterans had taught her to recognize the signs of those struggling with the transition to civilian life, and Jake Morrison's case had raised several red flags in her professional assessment. "Mr. Morrison," she said as she approached the work bay, "I'm Dr. Williams from the VA. I heard about what happened yesterday, and I wanted to check in and see how you're doing." Jake straightened up, his body language becoming more guarded. In his experience, official visits from government representatives rarely brought good news. "I'm fine, Dr. Williams. Just trying to get back to work." Dr. Williams recognized the defensive posture and the careful neutrality in his voice. "I'm not here in any official capacity, Mr. Morrison. I'm here because I'm concerned about one of our veterans who may have been treated unfairly by the system that's supposed to protect him." Her words, delivered with genuine warmth and concern, seemed to penetrate Jake's defenses slightly. Murphy, sensing that the conversation might be private, excused himself to work on another vehicle, though he remained within earshot in case Jake needed support. "Can I ask you something, Mr. Morrison?" Dr. Williams continued. "Have you been receiving the counseling and support services that are available to you through the VA?" Jake shook his head. "I tried counseling for a while after I got out, but it didn't seem to help much. Most of the counselors hadn't served, and they had trouble understanding what I was dealing with. The ones who were veterans seemed to have their own problems to work through." Dr. Williams nodded understandingly. "That's unfortunately common. The transition from military to civilian life is one of the most challenging experiences a person can face, and our support systems aren't always adequate to address the complex needs involved." She paused, studying Jake's face and body language for signs of the deeper struggles she suspected were present. "Mr. Morrison, yesterday's incident with Officer Sullivan may have been resolved legally, but I'm concerned about the emotional impact it may have had. Having your service questioned can reopen wounds that haven't fully healed." Jake was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh how much he was willing to reveal to this stranger who claimed to want to help. "Dr. Williams, I've spent the last 3 years trying to build a normal life. I found work I'm good at, a community that seemed to accept me, and something like peace. Yesterday reminded me that none of that is really secure, that there are always going to be people who see me as a threat or a fraud or something that doesn't belong." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Dr. Williams recognized the symptoms of someone who'd been carrying a heavy emotional burden without adequate support. "Mr. Morrison, would you be willing to consider participating in a veteran support group? Not traditional counseling, but a gathering of people who've shared similar experiences and can understand what you're going through." Jake's first instinct was to decline, but something about Dr. Williams' approach made him pause. Unlike the bureaucratic representatives he'd dealt with in the past, she seemed genuinely interested in his well-being rather than checking boxes on a form. "What kind of support group?" he asked cautiously. "We meet twice a month at the community center in the county seat. It's a mixed group. Veterans from different conflicts and different branches of service. Some are doing well. Others are struggling. But everyone understands the challenge of carrying experiences that civilian society doesn't really comprehend." Jake considered the offer while absently organizing tools on his workbench. The idea of talking about his experiences with strangers was uncomfortable, but the isolation he'd been experiencing was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. "I'll think about it," he said finally, which Dr. Williams recognized as progress from someone who'd probably been declining help for years. As Dr. Williams prepared to leave, she handed Jake a business card with her direct contact information. "Mr. Morrison, I want you to know that what happened yesterday was wrong, and it shouldn't have happened. But I also want you to know that you're not alone, and there are people who understand what you've been through and want to help." After she left, Jake found himself standing in the auto shop, holding the business card and trying to process the morning's conversation. The offer of support was tempting, but accepting help required admitting vulnerability, something that had been trained out of him during his military service and hadn't been easy to recover during his civilian transition. Murphy returned to the workbay, pretending he hadn't been listening to the conversation, but clearly curious about its outcome. "Seems like a good person," he observed neutrally. "Yeah," Jake agreed. "She seems genuine. It's just hard to know who to trust after yesterday." Murphy nodded understandingly. "Trust is like credits, son. It takes time to build, seconds to destroy, and a long time to rebuild. But you can't live without it entirely, or you end up isolated and bitter." The morning progressed with steady work and gradually returning normalcy, but Jake found his thoughts returning repeatedly to Dr. Williams' offer and to the broader questions her visit had raised about his isolation and his need for connection with people who understood his experiences. Around noon, the auto shop received an unexpected visitor in the form of Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, an elderly woman who lived on the outskirts of town and had been a fixture in the community for more than 60 years. She walked with a cane, but carried herself with the dignity of someone who'd faced life's challenges with grace and determination. Her visit to the auto shop was unusual enough to draw the attention of both Jake and Murphy. "Mr. Morrison," she said as she approached Jake's workstation, "I heard about what happened to you yesterday, and I wanted to tell you something." Jake wiped his hands and gave her his full attention, recognizing the kind of elderly person who deserved respect and careful listening. "My late husband served in Korea," Mrs. Hayes continued, her voice carrying the strength of someone accustomed to being heard. "When he came home, he faced many of the same challenges you're dealing with. People who questioned his service, employers who doubted his capabilities, neighbors who treated him like he was dangerous or unstable." She paused, leaning on her cane and studying Jake's face with eyes that had seen decades of human struggle and triumph. "What I learned during those years, Mr. Morrison, is that some people are afraid of what they don't understand, and they express that fear through suspicion and hostility. But there are also people in every community who recognize courage and sacrifice when they see it, and those are the voices that matter in the long run." Jake was moved by the elderly woman's words and by her decision to visit him personally. "Thank you, Mrs. Hayes. That means a lot." "There's something else," she continued. "My husband struggled for years with what we now call post-traumatic stress, though we didn't have a name for it then. He was too proud to ask for help, too stubborn to admit he was struggling. Don't make the same mistake he did, young man. Accept the help that's offered, and don't let pride prevent you from getting the support you need." Her words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom, and Jake found himself reconsidering his reflexive rejection of Dr. Williams' offer. Mrs. Hayes represented the kind of community elder whose advice was worth taking seriously. After she left, Jake returned to his work with a different perspective on the morning's events. The arrest had been humiliating and unjust, but it had also revealed the depth of support that existed for him in Riverside County. People like Murphy, Dr. Williams, and Mrs. Hayes were offering different forms of assistance, each recognition that he didn't have to face his challenges alone. The afternoon brought another unexpected development when Captain Rodriguez arrived at the auto shop for the second time in 2 days. Her expression was serious but not hostile, and Jake found himself wondering what new complications might be emerging from the previous day's incident. "Mr. Morrison," Rodriguez said as she approached, "I received confirmation from the Department of Defense about your military service. I wanted to personally apologize for the way you were treated, and to assure you that steps are being taken to prevent similar incidents in the future." Jake nodded appreciatively but remained guarded. "I appreciate that, Captain. What kind of steps?" Rodriguez chose her words carefully. "Officer Sullivan has been placed on administrative duty pending a complete review of his actions. The department will also be implementing additional training on veteran issues and on the proper procedures for investigating suspected stolen Valor cases." The news that Sullivan was facing consequences for his actions provided some satisfaction, but Jake was more interested in preventing future incidents than in seeing punishment for past ones. "Captain, can I ask you something?" Jake said. "What made you willing to question Sullivan's judgment yesterday? Most people in his position would have backed their officer regardless of the evidence." Rodriguez considered the question seriously. "Experience has taught me that good police work requires keeping an open mind and following the evidence wherever it leads." Officer Sullivan's certainty was impressive, but it wasn't supported by facts. More importantly, your behavior and responses suggested someone with genuine military experience, rather than someone attempting to deceive us. She paused, studying Jake's face. "There's something else, Mr. Morrison. During my conversation with the Department of Defense, I learned that your service involved operations that remain classified for national security reasons. That level of restriction isn't applied to ordinary military records." Jake's expression became more guarded. "I can't discuss the details of my deployments, Captain. Some things have to stay classified." Rodriguez nodded understandingly. "I'm not asking for classified information, Mr. Morrison. I'm simply acknowledging that your service was more significant than Officer Sullivan assumed, and that his failure to recognize that significance represents a serious error in judgment." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Tommy Chen, who had decided to extend his visit to Riverside County for another day. His presence provided a welcome buffer between Jake and the official nature of Rodriguez's visit, and his easy camaraderie helped diffuse some of the tension that had been building. "Captain," Tommy said as he joined the conversation, "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but your Officer Sullivan owes Jake more than just a professional apology. The man questioned the honor of someone who saved my life and the lives of several other soldiers. That's not something that should be taken lightly." Rodriguez appreciated Tommy's directness and the additional perspective he provided on Jake's character and service. "Mr. Chen, I assure you that Officer Sullivan's actions are being taken very seriously. The department has a responsibility to treat all citizens with respect and dignity, and that responsibility is especially important when dealing with veterans who've sacrificed for their country." As the conversation continued, Jake found himself appreciating the support he was receiving from multiple directions. Tommy's loyalty, Murphy's practical wisdom, Rodriguez's professional integrity, and the various other expressions of community support were helping to restore his faith in the basic decency of the people around him. The afternoon wore on with a gradual return to normalcy, though Jake remained aware that the incident would have lasting effects on his relationship with law enforcement and his standing in the community. Trust, as Murphy had observed, was difficult to rebuild once damaged, But the foundation for that rebuilding was beginning to take shape through the actions and words of people who'd chosen to stand with him rather than against him. As closing time approached, Jake reflected on the complex mix of emotions the day had brought. Anger and humiliation from the arrest, gratitude for the support he'd received, and a growing recognition that his isolation had been a choice rather than a necessity. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but it no longer seemed impossible. 3 weeks after Jake Morrison's arrest, the Riverside County Police Department received an unexpected visit that would forever change how the community viewed both the incident and the man at its center. A black sedan with government plates pulled into the station parking lot at precisely 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, carrying 2 passengers whose arrival had been coordinated through channels that bypassed normal local law enforcement protocols. Colonel James Mitchell stepped out of the passenger seat, his dress uniform immaculate, despite the long drive from the Pentagon. At 58, he carried himself with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that affected thousands of lives. His companion, a younger man in civilian clothes but with the unmistakable posture of military training, carried a leather briefcase secured with combination locks that suggested its contents were of significant importance. Captain Rodriguez had been notified of their arrival only an hour earlier, receiving a call that began with the phrase, "This is the Pentagon calling," and proceeded to request an immediate meeting regarding the Jake Morrison case. The brevity and urgency of the communication had left her with more questions than answers, but the federal authority behind the request made compliance non-negotiable. The 2 men were escorted directly to Rodriguez's office, where Colonel Mitchell wasted no time on pleasantries before addressing the purpose of their visit. "Captain Rodriguez, I'm here regarding Sergeant Jake Morrison and the incident that occurred 3 weeks ago involving one of your officers. This matter has implications that extend far beyond your jurisdiction, and it's time certain facts were brought to light." Rodriguez felt a knot forming in her stomach as she realized the Morrison case was about to become significantly more complicated. "Colonel, I have already received confirmation of Sergeant Morrison's service record and have taken appropriate disciplinary action regarding Officer Sullivan's conduct. What additional information can you provide?" Colonel Mitchell's expression remained grave as he opened the briefcase his companion had carried. "Captain, what I'm about to share with you is classified information that's being declassified specifically to address this situation. Sergeant Morrison's service record has been sealed not just for routine security reasons, but because his actions in Afghanistan saved the lives of over 200 American soldiers and prevented a strategic disaster that could have altered the entire course of our operations in that region." The weight of the colonel's words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Rodriguez had suspected that Morrison's restricted records indicated significant service, but she hadn't imagined anything of this magnitude. 3 years ago, Colonel Mitchell continued, Sergeant Morrison's Special Forces team was conducting a reconnaissance mission in a remote valley in Afghanistan when they discovered evidence of a massive coordinated attack being planned against multiple American bases. The intelligence they gathered indicated that insurgent forces had acquired advanced weaponry and were preparing to simultaneously strike 4 different installations, potentially killing hundreds of soldiers and civilians. Rodriguez listened intently as the colonel described a scenario that sounded like something from a military thriller rather than real events that had occurred just a few years earlier. Morrison's team was supposed to gather intelligence and withdraw, but when they realized the imminent nature of the threat, Sergeant Morrison made the decision to attempt disruption of the enemy preparations, despite being vastly outnumbered and operating without support. For 18 hours, his team conducted harassment operations that delayed the coordinated attack long enough for American forces to prepare defensive measures and launch preemptive strikes. The colonel paused, allowing the significance of the story to register. During those 18 hours, Sergeant Morrison personally eliminated over 30 enemy combatants, destroyed 2 weapons caches, and coordinated the rescue of 3 captured American soldiers who were being held in the same area. His actions were directly responsible for preventing what intelligence analysts later determined would have been the single deadliest attack on American forces since the beginning of the Afghanistan conflict. Rodriguez felt her understanding of Jake Morrison shifting as she absorbed this information. The quiet mechanic who'd been humiliated in her station was apparently a genuine war hero whose actions had saved countless lives. "Why are you telling me this now, Colonel?" she asked. "Because," Colonel Mitchell replied, "the incident with your Officer Sullivan has created a situation where Sergeant Morrison's cover has been compromised. His identity and location are now known to people who might not have his best interests at heart. More importantly, the treatment he received has come to the attention of senior military leadership, who are not pleased that a decorated soldier was subjected to public humiliation based on ignorance and prejudice." The implications of the colonel's words were becoming clear. This wasn't just about correcting a local law enforcement error. It was about addressing a situation that had embarrassed the military establishment and potentially endangered a valuable asset. "What do you need from us, Colonel?" Rodriguez asked. "I need Officer Sullivan to understand exactly what he did 3 weeks ago," Colonel Mitchell replied. "And I need this community to understand who Jake Morrison really is and what he sacrificed for this country." Meanwhile, across town at Murphy's auto shop, Jake Morrison was experiencing one of his better days since the arrest. The initial shock and humiliation had begun to fade, replaced by a growing sense of belonging as the community rallied around him. Dr. Williams had convinced him to attend his first veteran support group meeting, which had been more helpful than he'd expected. Tommy Chen had extended his visit indefinitely, deciding that Riverside County offered better opportunities than his previous location. Even Mrs. Hayes had become a regular visitor, bringing homemade cookies and stories about her late husband's struggles with readjustment. The normalcy of routine work was interrupted when Pete Murphy approached Jake's workstation with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Jake, you need to come see this. There are some official-looking folks here asking for you, and they don't look like they're here to cause trouble." Jake felt his stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. Visits from government representatives rarely brought good news in his experience. But when he emerged from the workbay, he was surprised to see Colonel Mitchell standing beside a police car, engaged in conversation with Captain Rodriguez and Officer Mitchell, who had apparently been summoned to witness whatever was about to unfold. "Sergeant Morrison," Colonel Mitchell said as Jake approached, using his military rank rather than civilian title for the first time since his discharge. "I'm Colonel Mitchell from the Pentagon. I believe we need to have a conversation." Jake's posture automatically straightened in response to the colonel's military bearing, though his expression remained cautious. "Sir, if this is about the incident 3 weeks ago, I thought that matter had been resolved." "It has been resolved from a legal standpoint, Sergeant, but there are other considerations that need to be addressed. Would you be willing to accompany us to the police station for a private discussion?" Jake glanced at Murphy, who nodded encouragingly, then at Captain Rodriguez, whose expression suggested this was an official request rather than an optional invitation. "Yes, sir, I'll come with you." The drive to the police station was conducted in silence, giving Jake time to wonder what new complications might be emerging from what he'd hoped was a closed chapter. The presence of a Pentagon colonel suggested that his case had attracted attention at levels he'd never imagined, which could be either very good or very bad depending on the military's current needs and priorities. Back at the police station, the group assembled in the main briefing room rather than Rodriguez's smaller office. Officer Sullivan had been summoned from his administrative duties, arriving with the nervous energy of someone who suspected his career was about to take another downward turn. His face was pale and his hands showed a slight tremor as he took a seat across from Jake, avoiding direct eye contact. Colonel Mitchell stood at the front of the room with the commanding presence of someone accustomed to addressing audiences of significant size. "Gentlemen, I'm here today to provide information that should have been available 3 weeks ago, but was prevented by classification restrictions. What I'm about to tell you will remain confidential, but it's essential that you understand the full context of Sergeant Morrison's service and the significance of the incident that occurred in this jurisdiction." He proceeded to repeat the account he'd given Rodriguez earlier, but with additional details that painted an even more compelling picture of Jake's heroism under fire. The room fell completely silent as the colonel described the 18-hour battle, the odds Jake had faced, and the strategic importance of his success. Officer Sullivan's face grew progressively paler as he realized the magnitude of his error. The man he'd arrested as a suspected fraud was apparently one of the most decorated soldiers of his generation, someone whose actions had prevented a catastrophic loss of American lives. Sergeant Morrison, Colonel Mitchell continued, turning to address Jake directly. Your actions in Afghanistan earned you the Silver Star, the Bronze Star with Valor device, and the Purple Heart. You were also recommended for the Medal of Honor, though that recommendation was ultimately classified for security reasons. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly distressed by the public revelation of information he'd kept private for years. Sir, I didn't ask for this recognition, and I'm not comfortable with having my service record discussed publicly. Colonel Mitchell's expression softened slightly. I understand your feelings, Sergeant, but the incident 3 weeks ago has created a situation where your privacy has already been compromised. The question now is whether the record will be set straight, or whether you'll continue to face questions about your legitimacy. He turned to address Officer Sullivan directly. Officer Sullivan, I want you to understand that when you arrested Sergeant Morrison, you weren't just making a mistake about a local citizen. You were humiliating a man who risked his life repeatedly to save others, who carried out operations that most people couldn't imagine, and who has continued to serve his community quietly and without recognition, despite having every right to expect respect and gratitude. Sullivan's voice was barely audible when he finally spoke. Sir, I had no way of knowing. His records were restricted, and he couldn't provide verification of his service when I asked. Officer Sullivan, Colonel Mitchell's voice carried unmistakable authority. The restrictions on Sergeant Morrison's records exist precisely because his service was so significant that it requires ongoing protection. Your failure to recognize that possibility and your rush to judgment based on assumptions and prejudices represents serious failures in professional judgment. The Colonel's criticism was delivered without malice, but with the kind of institutional weight that made it clear this wasn't just a personal opinion, but an official assessment of Sullivan's performance. Furthermore, Colonel Mitchell continued, your treatment of Sergeant Morrison has been reported through military channels to the Department of Defense, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and congressional representatives who take veteran affairs seriously. This incident has become a case study in how not to treat returning service members. Sullivan looked as if he might be physically ill as the full implications of his mistake became clear. His career in law enforcement was likely over, and his reputation in the community would never recover from the revelation that he'd arrested and humiliated a genuine war hero. Colonel Mitchell turned back to Jake, his expression becoming more personal. Sergeant Morrison, the military hasn't forgotten your service or your sacrifice. Your decision to live quietly and avoid recognition is admirable, but it shouldn't require you to hide your identity or accept disrespect from people who don't understand what you've given for this country. Jake struggled with emotions he'd kept buried for years as the Colonel's words forced him to confront the disconnect between his self-perception and the objective reality of his service. He'd spent so long focusing on the soldiers who hadn't made it home that he'd minimized his own achievements and sacrifices. What happens now, sir? Jake asked quietly. That's largely up to you, Sergeant. The military would welcome your return to active duty if you're interested. There are also civilian positions within the defense establishment that could utilize your skills and experience, or you can continue your current life with the understanding that your service record will no longer be restricted and you'll have the documentation needed to prevent future incidents like this one. The offer of multiple paths forward was both liberating and overwhelming for someone who'd been struggling with questions of identity and purpose since his discharge. Jake looked around the room at the faces watching him, seeing respect and admiration where there had once been suspicion and doubt. Captain Rodriguez spoke for the first time since the Colonel's presentation began. Sergeant Morrison, on behalf of the Riverside County Police Department, I want to offer you our most sincere apology and our gratitude for your service. We would be honored to have you work with us in any capacity you might consider appropriate. The offer surprised Jake, who'd never considered law enforcement as a potential career path. But the idea of using his skills and experience to serve his community in a different capacity had an immediate appeal. Pete Murphy, who'd been invited to witness the proceedings, cleared his throat before speaking. Jake, whatever you decide to do, you'll always have a place at the shop if you want it. but I suspect your talents might be put to better use in something bigger than fixing transmissions." Tommy Chen, who'd been quietly observing the proceedings, added his perspective. "Brother, you've spent 3 years hiding from who you really are. Maybe it's time to step into the light and let people see what real courage looks like." The support and encouragement from people who'd become important to him over the past weeks was overwhelming. Jake had spent so long believing he was alone that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be part of a community that valued and supported him. Officer Sullivan, who'd been silent through most of the proceedings, finally found his voice. "Sergeant Morrison, I know my apology can't undo what I did to you, but I want you to know that I was wrong about everything. I let my assumptions and prejudices cloud my judgment, and I treated you in a way that was completely inappropriate and unprofessional." His voice cracked slightly as he continued. "You deserved respect and dignity, and instead I gave you suspicion and humiliation. I'm sorry for that, and I'm sorry it took this meeting for me to understand the magnitude of my mistake." Jake studied Sullivan's face, seeing genuine remorse and recognition of error rather than just professional self-preservation. "Officer Sullivan, I accept your apology. We all make mistakes, and the important thing is learning from them." The grace with which Jake accepted the apology impressed everyone in the room and provided a final demonstration of the character that had made him an exceptional soldier and would make him valuable in whatever path he chose going forward. Colonel Mitchell concluded the meeting by presenting Jake with copies of his complete military record, including the commendations that had been classified for security reasons. "Sergeant Morrison, these belong to you, and you should never again have to prove your worthiness to anyone who questions your service." As the group prepared to leave the briefing room, Jake felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he'd been carrying for years. The secret burden of his hidden service, the constant anxiety about being questioned or discovered, and the isolation that had defined his civilian life were finally being replaced by recognition, community, and purpose. Outside the police station, as the government sedan prepared to return to Washington, Colonel Mitchell offered Jake one final piece of advice. "Sergeant, you've spent years trying to be invisible, but some people aren't meant to hide. The community that's grown around you here sees your value, and they're offering you a chance to serve again in a different capacity. Don't let fear or humility prevent you from accepting what you've earned." 3 months later, Jake Morrison stood before the Riverside County Board of Supervisors, taking the oath that would make him the county's new Director of Emergency Management and Veteran Services. The position had been created specifically for him, combining his military expertise with the community connections he'd developed and the trust he'd earned through his handling of the stolen Valor incident. Officer Derek Sullivan had resigned from the police department the day after the Pentagon meeting, recognizing that his credibility and judgment had been irreparably damaged. He'd moved to another state and taken a job in private security, carrying with him hard-learned lessons about assumptions, prejudice, and the importance of keeping an open mind. Captain Rodriguez had been promoted to sheriff, partly in recognition of her handling of the Morrison case and her commitment to treating all citizens with dignity and respect. The incident had become a training case study used throughout the state to teach law enforcement officers about veteran issues and the importance of proper investigation procedures. Pete Murphy had hired Tommy Chen as his shop's new manager, creating a veteran-friendly workplace that had become a model for other businesses in the region. The auto shop now served as an unofficial gathering place for local veterans, providing both employment opportunities and peer support for those struggling with civilian transition. Dr. Sarah Williams had expanded her veteran support programs with funding secured, partly through Jake's advocacy and connections. The success of the Riverside County model had attracted national attention and additional resources for veteran mental health services throughout the region. As Jake stood in his new office, looking out over the community that had become his home, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from isolation and suspicion to recognition and purpose. The stolen Valor arrest that had seemed like a devastating setback had ultimately become the catalyst for positive changes that extended far beyond his personal situation. The phone on his desk rang, interrupting his reflection. The caller was a veteran from a neighboring county who'd heard about Jake's story and was seeking advice about dealing with similar challenges in his own community. As Jake began offering guidance and support, he realized that his visibility and platform were allowing him to serve other veterans in ways he'd never imagined possible. The transformation from hidden mechanic to public servant had been difficult and sometimes painful, but it had also been necessary. Jake Morrison had finally found a way to honor his fallen brothers, serve his community, and build a life that acknowledged, rather than concealed, the experiences that had shaped him. Outside his office window, the mountains of Riverside County rose against a clear autumn sky, and the small town that had become his home went about its daily business, with the confidence that comes from being protected by people who understand the true meaning of service and sacrifice. 1 year after the Pentagon's revelation transformed his life, Jake Morrison stood at the podium of the Riverside County Community Center, addressing an audience of veterans, family members, and community leaders who had gathered for the county's first annual Veterans Recognition Ceremony. The auditorium was packed beyond capacity, with standing room only for those who had arrived late to witness what had become one of the most anticipated events in the county's social calendar. The transformation in Jake's appearance was striking to those who remembered the guarded, isolated mechanic who had worked quietly in Murphy's auto shop. Gone was the defensive posture and the careful anonymity that had defined his civilian persona. In their place stood a confident public servant whose bearing reflected both his military training and his hard-won understanding of community leadership. His uniform was crisp, his posture straight, and his eyes carried the clarity of someone who had finally found his place in the world. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jake began, his voice carrying easily to the back of the auditorium. "When I first came to Riverside County, I was running from my past and trying to disappear into anonymity. I believed that the best way to honor my fallen brothers was to carry their memory in silence, to serve quietly without drawing attention to myself or my experiences in Afghanistan." The audience listened intently as Jake recounted his journey from isolation to integration, from suspicion to respect. His story had become well known throughout the region, but hearing it directly from him carried a weight and authenticity that newspaper articles and second-hand accounts could never convey. "What I learned through the events of this past year," Jake continued, "is that hiding from our experiences doesn't honor those we've lost. True honor comes from using our experiences to serve others, from sharing our knowledge to make our communities stronger, and from ensuring that the sacrifices of our brothers and sisters in arms continue to mean something in peacetime." In the front row, Pete Murphy sat with his wife, beaming with the pride of someone whose instincts about character had been thoroughly vindicated. Beside him, Tommy Chen nodded approvingly at his friend's words, remembering the broken soldier he'd served with in Afghanistan, and marveling at the leader that man had become. Dr. Sarah Williams occupied a seat in the second row, taking notes for a presentation she would deliver the following month at a national conference on veteran integration. Jake's transformation had become a case study in successful community-based support systems, and his model was being replicated in counties across the country. Captain Rodriguez, now Sheriff Rodriguez, watched from the side of the auditorium where she stood with other law enforcement officials. The Morrison case had fundamentally changed her department's approach to veteran issues, leading to specialized training programs and community outreach initiatives that had become models for other agencies throughout the state. Notably absent from the ceremony was Derek Sullivan, whose resignation and departure from Riverside County had marked the end of a law enforcement career that had been destroyed by a single act of poor judgment. His absence served as a reminder of the lasting consequences that could result from allowing prejudice and assumptions to override evidence and common sense. Jake's speech continued with specific recognition of the community members who had supported him during his transition from isolation to leadership. He spoke about Murphy's unwavering loyalty, Dr. Williams' professional dedication, Mrs. Hayes' wisdom, and the countless other residents who had chosen to see potential rather than problems when they looked at a struggling veteran. "The lesson I want to share with you today," Jake said, looking directly at the veterans scattered throughout the audience, "is that communities are only as strong as their weakest members, and veterans are only as successful as the support systems that surround them. The transition from military to civilian life is one of the most challenging experiences a person can face, but it doesn't have to be faced alone. He paused, allowing his words to resonate with an audience that included dozens of veterans from conflicts spanning 5 decades. In the past year, Jake's office had become a hub for veteran services throughout the region, providing everything from job placement assistance to crisis intervention counseling. Over the past 12 months, Jake continued, our Veteran Services Program has helped place 47 veterans in meaningful employment, connected 32 families with housing assistance, and provided emergency support to dozens of individuals who were struggling with the challenges of readjustment. These numbers represent real people, real families, and real lives that have been improved through community support and understanding. The statistics were impressive, but Jake's presentation was more about the human stories behind the numbers. He spoke about Maria Santos, a Marine veteran who had struggled with PTSD and homelessness before finding stable housing and meaningful work through the county's Veteran Support Network. He described Robert Kim, an Army veteran who had been unemployed for 18 months before being matched with a local business owner who understood the value of military experience and training. Each of these success stories, Jake explained, represents a community that chose to invest in its veterans rather than simply thanking them for their service. Words of gratitude are meaningful, but concrete support and understanding are what actually make a difference in people's lives. The audience responded with sustained applause, recognizing the truth in Jake's words and the evidence of their community's commitment to veteran welfare. Riverside County had become known throughout the state for its innovative approaches to veteran integration, and delegations from other communities regularly visited to study their methods and programs. Jake's presentation shifted to address the broader challenges facing veterans nationwide, drawing on his experience as a regional coordinator for veteran services and his ongoing education in public administration. His role had evolved far beyond the original job description, as his expertise and credibility had led to consulting opportunities with state and federal agencies. The statistics on veteran unemployment, homelessness, and suicide remain unacceptably high across our nation, Jake said, his voice carrying the weight of personal knowledge about these issues. But communities like ours prove that these problems are not inevitable. When we commit to understanding rather than judging, when we offer opportunity rather than charity, and when we treat veterans as assets rather than liabilities, we can create environments where success becomes the norm rather than the exception. His words carried particular weight because they came from someone who had experienced both sides of the veteran transition experience. The isolation and suspicion he had faced during his early months in Riverside County had given him deep insight into the barriers that prevented successful reintegration, while his subsequent success demonstrated the potential that existed when those barriers were removed. The ceremony continued with the presentation of awards to community members who had made exceptional contributions to veteran welfare. Pete Murphy received recognition for his commitment to hiring and supporting veteran employees, while Dr. Williams was honored for her expansion of mental health services specifically designed for military families. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, now 83 years old but still sharp and engaged, received a Lifetime Achievement Award for her decades of support for veterans and their families. Her acceptance speech was brief but poignant, focusing on the responsibility of each generation to care for those who had served in the military. My husband came home from Korea changed by his experiences, Mrs. Hayes said, her voice clear despite her age. It took our community years to understand how to help him and others like him. We can't afford to repeat those mistakes with today's veterans. We must do better, and thanks to people like Jake Morrison, we are doing better. As the formal ceremony concluded, the audience moved to the community center's social hall for a reception that had become as important as the official presentations. Veterans from different eras mixed with community leaders, family members, and supporters, creating the kind of cross-generational dialogue that had become a hallmark of Riverside County's approach to veteran integration. Jake found himself surrounded by people wanting to share their own stories, ask for advice, or simply express their gratitude for the changes his leadership had brought to their community. Among them was Lisa Park, the waitress from the Pine Street Diner who had left her job to become a counselor specializing in veteran family issues after being inspired by Jake's example. "Mr. Morrison," she said, using the formal address despite their friendship, "I wanted to thank you for showing me that everyone can make a difference in veteran support, not just people with military experience. The family counseling program has helped so many people who were struggling in silence." Jake smiled, remembering the shy young woman who had served him coffee during his early months in town. Her transformation into a confident advocate for veteran families demonstrated the ripple effects that effective leadership could create throughout a community. The reception also provided an opportunity for Jake to connect with visitors from other communities who had come to learn about Riverside County's Veteran Services model. Representatives from 3 different states were present, along with officials from the Department of Veterans Affairs who were documenting successful programs for potential replication elsewhere. Among the visitors was Colonel Mitchell, now retired but serving as a consultant on veteran transition issues for the Pentagon. His presence at the ceremony represented both personal support for Jake and official recognition of the program's success at the federal level. "Sergeant Morrison," Colonel Mitchell said during a quiet moment between conversations, "when I came here a year ago to address the situation with Officer Sullivan, I never imagined it would lead to this kind of comprehensive community transformation. You've created something remarkable here." Jake reflected on the colonel's words as he looked around the social hall at the dozens of conversations taking place between veterans, community members, and officials from various agencies. The event represented far more than a simple recognition ceremony. It was evidence of a fundamental shift in how the community understood and supported its veteran population. "Colonel," Jake replied, "I think what we've created here proves that most communities want to support their veterans effectively. They just need leadership, resources, and examples of what success looks like." The stolen Valor incident was painful, but it also created an opportunity to address underlying issues that had been ignored for too long. As the evening progressed, Jake found himself in conversation with young veterans who were just beginning their transition to civilian life. Their questions and concerns reminded him of his own struggles during those difficult early months, when everything had seemed uncertain and overwhelming. "The most important thing to remember," Jake told a group of recently discharged soldiers, "is that the transition takes time, and it's okay to ask for help. The military teaches us to be self-sufficient and to solve problems independently, but civilian life often requires different skills and different kinds of support networks." His advice was based on hard-won experience and the observation of dozens of other veterans who had successfully navigated the challenges of readjustment. The program he had developed emphasized peer support, practical skill development, and community integration rather than traditional therapeutic approaches that many veterans found ineffective or uncomfortable. The evening's final presentation was delivered by Jake himself, addressing the entire gathering about the future vision for veteran services in Riverside County and the broader region. His plans were ambitious, but grounded in the practical experience he had gained over the past year of program development and implementation. "Our goal for the coming year," Jake announced, "is to establish Riverside County as a regional center for veteran services excellence. We're developing partnerships with colleges and universities to provide educational opportunities specifically designed for military veterans. We're working with local businesses to create apprenticeship programs that utilize military experience and training. And we're expanding our crisis intervention capabilities to serve veterans throughout the entire Northwestern region." The vision he outlined represented a dramatic expansion of services and influence, but it was based on proven success and growing demand from communities that lacked adequate veteran support infrastructure. Jake's reputation had spread far beyond Riverside County, and he was regularly invited to consult with other communities seeking to develop similar programs. As the ceremony and reception concluded, Jake stood on the steps of the community center, watching as attendees dispersed into the cool evening air. The event had been a success by any measure, but more importantly, it represented the kind of community engagement and support that made real difference in people's lives. Tommy Chen joined him on the steps, both men enjoying the quiet after hours of intense social interaction. Their friendship had deepened over the past year as they had worked together on various veteran outreach initiatives, and Tommy had become Jake's closest advisor on program development and implementation. "You know," Tommy said, looking out over the parking lot where cars were slowly departing, "a year ago, you were just trying to fix engines and stay invisible. Now you're running programs that are being copied across the country. That's quite a transformation." Jake nodded, still somewhat amazed by the path his life had taken since that morning when Officer Sullivan had pulled him over for a broken taillight. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Sullivan hadn't arrested me that day. Would I still be hiding in Murphy's shop, avoiding connections and pretending my experience didn't matter?" "Maybe," Tommy replied, "but I think eventually something would have forced you out of hiding. You're not the kind of person who can stay invisible forever. Your skills and your commitment to helping others would have found a way to surface eventually." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Dr. Williams, who had been coordinating with Jake on several upcoming conferences where they would present their community-based model for veteran integration. Her academic credentials and Jake's practical experience had proven to be a powerful combination for influencing policy and program development at state and federal levels. "Jake," she said, "I wanted to thank you again for agreeing to keynote the national conference next month. Your story and your program are exactly what other communities need to hear about." The invitation to address a national audience of veteran service providers represented another milestone in Jake's evolution from isolated individual to recognized leader in veteran affairs. His presentations had become sought after because they combined personal authenticity with practical expertise and measurable results. As the three friends walked toward their cars, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The stolen Valor arrest that had seemed like a devastating humiliation had ultimately become the catalyst for positive changes that extended far beyond his personal situation. Officer Sullivan's mistake had forced Jake to confront his isolation and had created opportunities for service and leadership that he never could have imagined. The lights of Riverside County stretched out below them as they reached the parking lot, a reminder of the community that had embraced Jake and supported his transformation from hidden veteran to public servant. Each light represented families and individuals whose lives had been touched in some way by the veteran services programs that had grown from the seeds of that traumatic morning 1 year earlier. As Jake drove home through the quiet streets of his adopted town, he thought about the veterans who would be arriving in the coming weeks to participate in the programs he had developed. Each would bring their own struggles, their own talents, and their own potential for contribution to the community that was learning to see veterans as assets rather than problems. The transformation of Riverside County into a model for veteran integration had required changes in attitudes, policies, and practices that went far beyond what anyone could have predicted, from the simple act of correcting one officer's mistake. But the foundation for all of those changes had been the community's willingness to choose understanding over judgment, investment over charity, and inclusion over isolation. Jake's story had become proof that individual transformation and community development could reinforce each other in ways that created lasting positive change. His journey from suspected fraud to recognized leader demonstrated the potential that existed when communities committed to supporting their veterans with more than just words of gratitude. As he pulled into his driveway, Jake could see the mountains of Riverside County silhouetted against the star-filled sky, a reminder of the natural beauty that surrounded the community he now served. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new veterans seeking support and guidance. But tonight, he could rest with the satisfaction of knowing that his service continued, that his brother's sacrifices were being honored through his work, and that the community he had chosen as his home was stronger because of the journey he had traveled from isolation to integration. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.